Millionaire underestimated, a delivery girl, but discovered a legal genius and fell in love. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain poured steadily, casting a pale golden glow across the slick pavement. Cars drifted past like shadows. In the middle of it all, a young woman on a worn-out bicycle raced through traffic, cutting between puddles and flashing headlights, her eyes set, unwavering. Sarah Evans, 26, soaked to the bone, barely felt the chill anymore. She wasn't racing the rain, she was racing time. 2 minutes left. If I'm late, I lose half my day's pay, she muttered, her breath fogging in the cold. She swerved hard, nearly colliding with a pedestrian too engrossed in his phone. No apologies. No time. Her focus was locked on one thing, the final delivery of her shift. She skidded to a stop in front of a towering glass building. It shimmered like a monument to people who never had to worry about making rent. Sarah parked her bike, jogged past the security, and entered the marble lobby. Her shoes squeaked on the polished floor. Everyone in the lobby looked like they belonged on magazine covers. She didn't flinch. No time to care. Ahead, the elevator doors opened. A group of sharply dressed professionals entered, their voices low, measured, and urgent. Sarah slipped in just as the doors were about to close. A narrow escape, until a soft chime broke the silence. Beep, beep, beep. Overweight limit. And then he stepped in. Tall, impeccably dressed. His suit was pressed, his hair styled with the kind of precision that suggested he never ran late. The scent of subtle cologne lingered with his presence. He was the last one in, and the reason the alarm went off. The others exchanged uncomfortable glances. "You need to step out," someone said vaguely. Sarah, soaked and breathless, turned and looked directly at him. "You got in last. You should be the one to leave." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to that way. "Me?" "Yes," she replied flatly. "Basic elevator etiquette." One of the lawyers leaned in. "Do you know who he is?" Sarah blinked. "Do I care?" The man stared at her. He didn't argue. He didn't scoff. He just watched her, studied her. And then with a faint smile, he calmly stepped back out. The doors closed. The elevator rose. Sarah exhaled. She had no idea she'd just challenged Nicholas Smith, CEO of one of the top law firms in the city. She had no idea she'd just kicked open the door to a completely different life. Minutes later, she stepped out on the 28th floor, handed off the order, and glanced down at the receipt. Nicholas Smith. Her stomach dropped. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else had ordered on his behalf. But as she knocked on the office door and heard a smooth voice call, "Come in," she already knew. Nicholas looked up from his desk and smiled, amused and genuinely surprised. "You again." Sarah held up the food bag. "Here's your lunch, Mr. Elevator Etiquette." He chuckled. "So that's what I'm known for now." She set the bag down with a bit more force than necessary. "You're lucky I'm not charging you extra for the attitude tax." Nicholas leaned back in his chair, eyes still locked on her. "You've got fire. That's rare these days." Sarah rolled her eyes and turned to leave, but Nicholas wasn't done. Not even close, and neither was fate. Sarah stood in front of the sleek glass door, hoping, just for a second, that the order wasn't meant for someone important. Maybe just an assistant, a clerk, anyone. But when she read the polished silver nameplate, Nicholas Smith, CEO, her gut sank. She knocked. A calm, confident voice answered from inside. "Come in." She stepped into a space unlike any other she'd delivered to. No leftover coffee cups, no clatter of keyboards. This office was quiet, precise, like the man sitting behind the large desk at its center. Nicholas looked up. His gaze, cool and steady, scanned her like a spotlight sweeping a stage. When he recognized her, his lips curved. Not quite a smirk, not quite a smile. "You again?" Sarah lifted the food bag with a neutral face. "Lucky you. And here I thought lunch would be uneventful today." He set the bag down on his desk like it was a court document, not takeout. She turned to leave, expecting this odd moment to be over. But his voice stopped her. "Let me ask you something," he said casually, peeling the lid off the container like this conversation meant nothing. "If an employee is fired without a clear reason, can they sue?" Sarah paused. Was he joking? Testing her? Maybe both. But her reply was immediate, clear, and crisp. "Depends. If the contract doesn't spell it out, or it violates labor law, yes, and it also depends on whether their lawyer is sharp enough to catch it." Silence. Nicholas looked up slowly, and in that exact moment, something shifted. Gone was the amused, detached expression. What replaced it was focus and curiosity. This wasn't the reaction he expected from a drenched food courier. "Interesting," he said, studying her the way a chess master studies an unexpected move. A delivery girl just walked into his office and spoke like a litigator, possibly sharper than a few sitting downstairs. Without another word, Nicholas opened a drawer, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the desk. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is this another test?" He gave her a smile, not wide, but meaningful. "Maybe, but not the kind you think." She glanced down at the card. His name, his number. No promises, no explanations. Just a door left ajar. As Sarah stepped out of his office, the rain outside had finally stopped. But inside her, a storm had just begun. The city hadn't changed. It still buzzed, roared, and moved with the same relentless pace. The same taxis honked without patience. People hurried by with eyes glued to screens. And somewhere above it all, planes sliced across a cold morning sky. But for Sarah Evans, everything had changed. She stood at the foot of the tower, Smith and Associates, the same building where she had delivered food just the day before, soaking wet, exhausted, and with zero expectations beyond a tip. Now she was back, not as a delivery girl, not as someone passing through, but as someone ready to walk through the front door with purpose. In her right hand, she held Nicholas Smith's business card, still flawless, despite the way her thumb had pressed into its corners all night long. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Because returning wasn't just about walking into a law firm. It was about walking back into a part of herself she'd buried years ago. 5 years earlier. A cramped apartment, peeling paint on the walls. The smell of hospital sanitizer never quite faded from her clothes. Sarah was only 19, a second-year law student. And she was good. Top 10% of her class, sharp-tongued, faster than most to find loopholes in hypothetical contracts. Professors liked her. Some even said she had a gift. But gifts meant nothing when life decided to break the rules. "Your mother's collapsed again." The neighbor's voice on the phone was flat, like they'd said it one too many times already. "Ambulance is on the way." Sarah dropped the phone. Her study notes scattered like dead leaves across the kitchen floor. That night she withdrew from college. Not because she wanted to, because she had no choice. Her mother had no one else, no income, no health care, no time. And Sarah had to become everything at once. Caretaker, breadwinner, nurse, errand runner, and eventually, delivery driver. She remembered sitting in the hospital cafeteria, staring at her reflection in a vending machine. Behind her eyes, you could still see a flicker of the old Sarah, the one who argued her way into the dean's advanced track. But over time, that flicker dimmed. Still, she made herself a silent promise. "I'll come back. One day." Not for grades, not for glory, but for me. The wind blew Sarah's hair across her cheek as she stared up at the skyscraper. She still wasn't sure what Nicholas had seen in her the day before. Was it her nerve? Her sarcasm? Or maybe, just maybe, he'd seen a glimpse of the lawyer she could have been, the one that never got the chance. Her fingers gripped the card tighter. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Don't be late. His words had sounded like a test, a dare, maybe even an invitation. But Sarah wasn't walking in for Nicholas Smith. She was walking in for that 19-year-old girl who never got to finish what she started. Inside, the lobby gleamed. Everything was sharp edges and polished surfaces. Suits passed her by. Heels clacked. Voices echoed. But this time, no one looked at her like she didn't belong. Because this time, she didn't carry a delivery bag. She carried herself differently. The receptionist, the same woman from the day before, raised her eyebrows, just slightly, but offered a professional smile. Back so soon? Not for delivery, Sarah replied, slipping the card onto the desk. I have an appointment. The woman nodded, picked up the phone and spoke quietly into the receiver. A pause. Then, Mr. Smith will see you now. 28th floor. Sarah turned toward the elevators, her heart pounding. But it wasn't fear. It was electricity. This wasn't about getting a job. This was about getting a part of her life back. As the elevator doors opened, she stepped in and looked at her reflection in the brushed steel panel. There were circles under her eyes, a faint scar above her brow from an old bike accident, hair she'd trimmed herself last week to save money. And still, she looked ready, because for the first time in years, she wasn't walking into a shift or a delivery or a dead end. She was walking into a second chance, and this time, she wasn't going to let anyone, not illness, not struggle, not the past, stand in her way. The elevator doors opened with a quiet ding. Sarah stepped out onto the 28th floor, this time without a food delivery bag. Her shoes clicked against polished marble. Her blazer, second-hand but neatly pressed, held its shape with quiet defiance. She didn't walk like she belonged here. Not yet. But she walked like she would. Soon. Nicholas Smith had made no promises, no glowing introductions. He'd simply handed her a manila folder and said, "Temporary contract assistant. You'll be working out of the copy room for now." That was it. No handshake, no tour, just a test. And Sarah Evans had never backed down from a test. They called it an auxiliary workstation, but it was barely more than a closet with a desk wedged between an industrial copier and a decades-old filing cabinet. It smelled faintly of toner and old coffee grounds. Still, it had a desk, and a chair, and a stack of real legal contracts. For Sarah, that was enough. She sat, flipped open the first file, and began to read. She didn't skim. She didn't glance. She dissected. She scanned every line like a surgeon studying a patient's chart, searching for anything that didn't belong. And she found it. A misplaced comma that changed the interpretation of a liability clause. A sentence structured so vaguely it left millions in potential exposure. A contradiction between two paragraphs that no one had reconciled. By the time the office lights began to dim, Sarah had flagged 7 critical errors in a single agreement that had passed through 3 senior attorneys. The next morning, someone noticed. Nicholas walked past her desk, glanced at her notes, and paused. "Who caught this?" he asked an associate. The answer was met with silence. Later that afternoon, Sarah received another file. Thicker, denser, more complex. She knew exactly who it came from. Not everyone was amused. Hyder Reynolds had been at the firm for 10 years. He was everything you'd expect from a top-tier litigator. Pressed suits, sharp jawline, a reputation for precision and ego in equal parts. He'd won cases no one thought winnable. And now, some delivery girl, was sitting in a closet, correcting the work of his team. He didn't just dislike her. He resented her, and he wasn't alone. It started with murmurs, then looks, then calculated slights, a meeting invite sent to the wrong email, a report accidentally deleted before she could finish it, colleagues walking past her without returning a hello, and behind it all, Hyder. He didn't attack directly. That wasn't his style. Instead, he launched an internal audit, quietly pulling her HR file, requesting her resume, and digging into her past. And he found exactly what he'd hoped for. No law degree, no bar certification, and a former job history that included a string of delivery companies. To him, it was confirmation. She doesn't belong here. He made his move on a Tuesday. The office was still buzzing with post-lunch calls when Sarah went to retrieve a stapler from the supply room. When she turned around, Hyder was standing behind her, hands in his pockets, eyes gleaming with condescension. "So," he began, "how's it feel? Playing lawyer?" Sarah blinked. "I'm not playing anything. You know, people here went to Yale, Harvard, they passed the bar. Some of us bled for this job. You came through the service elevator." The insult landed, but Sarah didn't show it. "Funny," she said calmly. "That's the same elevator your mistakes came up on yesterday, and I had to correct them." A flicker in Hyder's jaw, barely visible. She walked past him, didn't look back. Nicholas said nothing. He didn't defend her, didn't reprimand Hyder. When she approached him, file in hand, fire in her eyes, he simply looked at her and said, "If you're going to stay here, don't lean on me." "Then why bring me here?" she asked, genuinely unsure if she was being groomed or tested. Or both. Nicholas leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Because I've seen you think, and I know talent when I see it. But this place, it chews people up. If you want to stay, don't ask for space." "What then?" "Take it. Make them unable to deny you." He didn't smile. He didn't reassure. He just turned back to his paperwork and let her walk out. That night, Sarah didn't go home right away. She sat at her desk until the cleaning staff began vacuuming the hallway. One by one, the floors emptied. The building slept. But she didn't. She stayed. She worked. She sharpened, because Nicholas was right. If she wanted to stay, she couldn't rely on mercy. She had to become the one thing people in power couldn't ignore: useful, necessary, unshakable. And if Hyder wanted a war, he'd picked the wrong woman to challenge. The morning sky was the kind that made people walk faster. Gray, with a promise of rain. Inside the towering glass building of Smith & Associates, the air smelled of money and pressure. It was the kind of place where no one ever ran, but everyone moved like time was money. Sarah Evans stepped off the elevator, no longer a delivery girl, not yet a lawyer. Her clothes were plain but sharp, a quiet rebellion against the designer suits swirling around her. She carried nothing but a notepad, a pen, and the unshakable awareness that today could either be a breakthrough or a breaking point. Nicholas had said just one thing that morning. "You're sitting in on the Callahan negotiation." No explanation, no encouragement. But his eyes, just for a second, had lingered on her like he knew she was ready, even if no one else did. The conference room door opened like the gate to a coliseum. 12 people were already inside, suits in shades of black and gray, files spread across the polished walnut table like weapons before a duel. At the head of the table sat Mr. Callahan, CEO of a billion-dollar tech firm. His expression was carved from stone. 2 seats down sat the opposing counsel, lawyers representing Callahan's largest supplier. Between them, a contract dispute that had dragged for weeks over a single clause. Sarah took a seat along the edge, not quite in the spotlight, but close enough to feel the heat. The clause in question? Termination rights. Both sides wanted control. Neither wanted risk. And after 3 weeks of revisions, meetings, and shouting matches, the contract still hadn't moved an inch. As voices began to rise again, Callahan's general counsel insisting on one interpretation, the supplier pushing back, Sarah's fingers brushed the edge of the folder. She had read the draft earlier that morning. She had noticed something then, and now, as she listened, her instincts screamed louder. She turned to Nicholas. "May I?" He gave the faintest nod. Sarah stood. The room quieted, not out of respect, but confusion. She walked slowly toward the center of the table, picked up a dry erase marker, and wrote 2 short sentences on the glass board. Termination clause may be executed with 30 days written notice provided both parties agree in writing. Amendments must be mutually documented and approved prior to execution. Then she turned around. "This wording protects both sides," she said calmly. "It prevents unilateral action without locking anyone into a hostage clause. No theatrics, no speech, just clarity." For a full 10 seconds, the room was silent. Then Callahan leaned forward and muttered, "She's right." The supplier's lawyer frowned, reading it again. Then he nodded. Nicholas said nothing, but his eyes were steady. Mr. Callahan signed the revised draft with one smooth motion. Before leaving, he turned to Nicholas. "You've got good instincts in your team." Then, to Sarah, this time looking directly at her. "That was sharp work, Miss Evans. Most people in this room didn't see what you just did." Sarah smiled, small and measured, but inside, something shook. Not nerves, validation. Later that afternoon, a thick folder landed on Sarah's desk. No name attached, just a yellow sticky note with a smiley face. She flipped through the first pages. An employment settlement agreement, seemingly routine. But the language, it was too smooth, too careful. And then she found it. Clause 8.4. A line that, if left unedited, would let the company waive financial obligation without legal consequence. Completely illegal under state labor law. The kind of clause that, if filed, would destroy client trust and open the firm to a lawsuit. It wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. Sarah didn't march to Hyder's office. She didn't print screenshots or raise her voice. Instead, she picked up her pen and wrote in the margin. Clause 8.4 appears to contradict both client expectation and Section 512B of Labor Code. Unless we're looking to start a class action from inside our own house, I'd suggest a revision. She underlined the last sentence. Then she slipped the file into Hyder's outbox and went back to her work. The next day, Hyder passed her desk. His lips pressed into a pale line, his eyes locked onto her notes, and he said nothing. Because what could he say? She hadn't accused, she hadn't exposed, she'd simply shown she was smarter and kinder than he expected. And that's what cut deepest. That evening, Nicholas watched her from across the floor. She was reviewing another contract, legs crossed, face unreadable, pen tapping gently against the table. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because Sarah was already proving what he'd suspected since the elevator ride. She didn't need a title to be respected. She didn't need credentials to be dangerous. She just needed a seat at the table. And now no one could deny she'd earned it. Sarah sat in her small office as the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting the city in a soft gold. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, blurred but growing clearer. She wasn't a lawyer yet, but she was becoming something just as powerful, a force to be reckoned with. The city had begun to wind down. Streetlights blinked to life, casting amber reflections across the wet sidewalks. Traffic thinned. The world slowed. But on the 28th floor of a high-rise in downtown Chicago, 2 people were still awake, still working. The legal department of Smith & Associates was a hive of ambition during daylight hours, but after 10 o'clock, it transformed into something else entirely, a quiet battleground for the most relentless. Tonight, only 2 desks remained lit. Sarah Evans, dressed in a gray sweater and black slacks, sat hunched over a contract. Her hair, once neatly tied back, had loosened into soft waves, falling across her cheek as she reviewed clause after clause with surgical focus. A pen spun between her fingers as her eyes scanned each line with the intensity of someone who couldn't afford to miss a single word. Across the office, behind a wall of glass and silence, Nicholas Smith sat alone in his corner office, illuminated by the warm glow of a desk lamp. His blazer hung on the back of his chair, tie loosened, sleeves rolled. He wasn't reading anymore. He was watching her, noticing the way she chewed gently on the end of her pen when she was deep in thought, the way she muttered quietly to herself when she spotted a contradiction, the way she never once reached for her phone or checked the time. She was all in. Just like him. But tonight would shift everything. At 10:46 p.m., Sarah's phone buzzed sharply against her desk. She answered on instinct, barely glancing at the screen. Hello? A beat. Then her body stiffened. What happened? Is she conscious? I'm coming. She ended the call. Fast. Her pen dropped. Her chair scraped the floor as she stood, abruptly, sharply. Nicholas emerged from his office. Sarah? She didn't answer. She was already gathering her bag, hands trembling ever so slightly as she zipped it shut. Sarah. His voice was firm, lower now. She turned, her eyes glassy but defiant. My mom. She collapsed. The hospital just called. Do you need a ride? Her lips parted, ready to refuse out of instinct, but something in his eyes stopped her. Not pity, not concern. Steady presence. She nodded once. Yes, please. Chicago's streets shimmered under a light rain. Nicholas's car, a sleek black sedan, hummed through the wet avenues with quiet grace. Inside, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was fragile. Sarah stared out the window, arms folded tight across her chest, jaw clenched. Every now and then, her fingers would twitch, almost reaching for something unseen. Nicholas didn't speak. He didn't need to. Eventually, she broke the silence, not to make conversation, but because the weight in her chest became too much to carry alone. She's the reason I dropped out. Her voice was thin, almost apologetic. Second year of law school, I was on the dean's list. Professors told me I had a gift, but then she got sick. Stage 4. She looked down at her hands. I didn't even think. I just walked away. From school, from everything. Started delivering groceries, working nights, whatever it took. Nicholas's hands tightened subtly on the steering wheel, but he said nothing. He just listened. People think I'm here chasing a second chance, but the truth is, I never even got a first one. Her voice cracked. She turned away from him, blinking hard at the glass. And now I'm scared that if I do this, if I really try, I'll fail, and that'll be worse. The car rolled to a stop at a red light. Rain tapped against the roof like soft applause. Then Nicholas spoke. Quiet. Measured. You're not the only one who's failed. She glanced at him. 3 years ago, I misjudged a case, got cocky, skipped a review because I thought I knew better. We lost a $12 million suit, almost sank the firm. He looked straight ahead, his face unreadable. The night the judgment came down, I walked home alone in the snow. Didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. Everyone wanted me out. Half my partners left. I spent the next year earning back every client one by one. Silence again. But this time, a new understanding settled in the space between them. Two people, two broken timelines, two paths shattered, now quietly merging. Nicholas pulled into the hospital lot. Before Sarah could open the door, he stopped her gently with a hand on her arm. You don't have to do everything alone. She looked at him. Really looked, and something in her eyes softened. I'm not used to people staying. Well, he said with the ghost of a smile, I'm not most people. She came back at 12:30 a.m., hair damp from the rain, eyes red but clear, shoulders squared. Nicholas was still there in the office's empty glow, with 2 cups of bad coffee sitting on a desk full of paperwork. He didn't ask how her mother was. She didn't offer details. He handed her the coffee wordlessly. She took it, breathed it in, and said quietly, Clause 7 in the Patterson contract needs tightening. The indemnity language is vague. Nicholas gave a small laugh. Not at her. With her. They returned to work. But something had shifted. They didn't speak of it, didn't define it. But it lingered, in stolen glances, in the shared silences, in the careful way they navigated each other's presence. They were still CEO and assistant, still professional, still sharp. But now, they were something else too, something unnamed, something fragile, something real, is vague. Nicholas gave a small laugh. Not at her. With her. They returned to work. But something had shifted. They didn't speak of it, didn't define it. But it lingered, in stolen glances, in the shared silences, in the careful way they navigated each other's presence. They were still CEO and assistant, still professional, still sharp. But now, they were something else too. Something unnamed, something fragile, something real. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the tension in the boardroom was already thick like fog on a winter morning. Smith and Associates had called an emergency meeting, an internal hearing that, unofficially, carried the weight of a trial. At the center of it all was Sarah Evans, standing at one end of the long mahogany table, her back straight, her chin lifted. No title, no law degree, no allies in sight. And yet, she stood her ground. Across from her sat Hyder Lynch, the senior partner who had filed the formal complaint against her. He adjusted his tie with practiced arrogance and slid a thin manila folder toward the board. Insubordination, misrepresentation, unauthorized legal analysis. I'm requesting immediate termination, he announced, his voice cold and clinical. The room was still. A few board members exchanged glances. Nicholas Smith, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes unreadable. Hyder leaned back, confident. We cannot allow an unlicensed outsider to operate under the guise of a legal professional. It sets a dangerous precedent. Everyone turned to Sarah. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she opened the folder she'd brought with her. It wasn't thick, just a dozen pages, neatly tabbed and organized. She placed it on the table and slid it forward. I'm not here to debate my qualifications, she said calmly. I'm here to let my work speak for itself. Her voice was steady, clear, but held a quiet steel. The first section details 7 contract errors, overlooked by our senior legal team, that could have exposed the firm to millions in liability. She flipped to the next tab. The second is documentation of 3 lawsuits I assisted with, all won. One of them, she glanced at Hyder, was yours. A slight shift, a murmur down the line. And finally, the third section contains direct feedback from clients, including Mr. Langford, who wrote, and I quote, "That young woman is the reason I signed the deal. She asked the questions your lawyers didn't. Silence fell again. This time, deeper. Hyder's confident smirk was gone. His jaw clenched. A board member cleared his throat. Is this true, Nicholas? Nicholas met Sarah's gaze for a brief second before answering. Every word. No one questioned further. The chair of the board closed the folder and looked to Hyder. Your motion is denied. Effective immediately, Sarah Evans is recognized as a full-time employee under the title of legal consultant, and will be reviewing your conduct moving forward, Mr. Lynch. A long silence followed. Hyder stood slowly, nodded stiffly, and left without another word. Sarah exhaled, but only slightly. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded once, gathered her folder, and walked out of the boardroom. Nicholas waited. He caught up with her just outside, in the quiet of the empty corridor. The buzz of fluorescent lights above, the echo of distant footsteps. Everything else seemed to fall away. You didn't have to do it that way, he said softly. I did, she replied, not looking at him. If I leaned on you, they'd say I only made it because you carried me. He stepped closer. But you didn't. You carried yourself. She finally met his eyes. There was gratitude there, and something else, something unspoken, deep in the quiet space between them. I'm tired, she admitted after a pause. You should be, he said. You just won your first war. They didn't hug. They didn't touch. But the air between them pulsed with something raw and human, respect, understanding, and the beginning of something they couldn't name. Not yet, but soon. Because that day, Sarah Evans didn't just survive. She arrived. It was nearly 9 p.m. Most of the office had gone dark. The cleaning crew had already passed through once, but one light still shone faintly from the corner office. Nicholas Smith's. Sarah Carter had just finished organizing a mountain of files when she got the message. Come upstairs. Just you. No context, no signature. But she knew who it was. When she arrived, the room was quieter than usual. The city lights poured in through the massive windows behind Nicholas, casting long shadows across the mahogany floor. He was seated, unusually calm, with a thick folder in front of him. One that didn't look like the usual stacks of contracts or briefs. He gestured for her to sit. Sarah blinked, unsure. She took the seat opposite him. I thought we were done with deals for the day, she said, her voice laced with tired humor. Nicholas smiled, but it was different this time. Softer, almost shy. He slid the folder across the table. She opened it out of habit, and then froze. Inside wasn't a contract for a new client, but a marriage license. Her name was there, written in clear black ink beside his. Nicholas Smith and Sarah Carter. She looked up, completely still. Nicholas leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on hers. The first time we met, he began, we argued over elevator etiquette. The second time we debated legal loopholes. Every moment since has been some version of a negotiation. He paused. His voice dropped, low and steady. I've signed thousands of contracts in my life, but there's only one that ever truly mattered, and I want to sign it with you. Tears welled in her eyes, not from shock, not even from joy, but from the quiet, overwhelming weight of everything she had been through to reach this point. She remembered the rain-drenched delivery uniform, the sleepless nights beside her mother's hospital bed, the whispering co-workers, the fights she fought silently in boardrooms, in her own heart. And now, this man. Not saving her, not completing her, just standing beside her, offering something real. Sarah reached across the desk, her hand trembling as it met his. I walked this whole road alone, she whispered, but you... You were the first person who never tried to carry me. You just walked beside me." Nicholas smiled. "No more contracts between us," he said. "Just one promise." And as she nodded, the city lights shimmered behind them like stars bearing witness. Never underestimate someone just because they haven't had a chance to prove themselves yet. Sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest in the room. They're the ones who've had to build a voice from nothing. So if you're out there, still standing in the rain, still waiting for someone to notice you, still trying to believe you deserve a place in the room, this is your sign. Knock on the door, then walk through it like you've always belonged. Because maybe you have. If you've watched till the end, drop a comment with "I believe in second chances" to let us know you're one of the real ones. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because every one of us has a Sarah inside.